Fly me to the moon, let me play.
This is Rudy Molho, born September 30th, 1932. I was born in the Bronx. My parents were Albert and Matilda Molho. They're from Salonika, Greece, Sephardic Jews. The neighborhood we lived in the Bronx was a Jewish neighborhood. There were a few Italians, but it was a Jewish neighborhood. But most of the people we knew, that my mother knew, were other people that migrated from Salonika. So, and the Sephardic Jews were those that I knew. My friends were Ashkenazi from Poland, those other Russian areas. But my family hung around with the Sephardic Jews. As you may know, Sephardic Jews are those who were thrown out of Spain in the 1400s, and they immigrated to many different countries, including Salonika was one of the countries they immigrated to. Unfortunately, most of the family remained in Salonika and didn't follow them to America, and almost all of them were annihilated in concentration camps during the Second World War. Out of all the people that were killed during the Holocaust, we had two cousins that survived Auschwitz, and they came back to Salonika. Their wives were killed, their children were killed, but they started new lives, and quite successfully. They opened a printing business in Salonika and raised sons, and ended up having a good life after that horror. I lived on the second floor of a walk-up, a one-bedroom apartment, and I had a sister, Florence, and we lived in a one-bedroom apartment. I slept in the living room, and my sister slept in the bedroom with my parents, and it didn't seem to be inconvenient. Nowadays, I wonder how we did it, but we did it very well and very easily with no problem, and no air conditioning, and it was fine. Most of my friends lived in somewhat the same conditions. We had a few friends who were a little bit better off, but not much. But we never felt poor or with any of those monetary problems. It was a good upbringing. Most of my friends, unfortunately, didn't go through school, but some of them turned out to be very successful, and others went to jail. I was a cross-country runner, 2.5 miles, and during the spring season, I did cross-country run in the fall. During the spring season, I ran quarter mile. The highlight of my life there was this club we had, the Stallions. We had this jacket, and it had a stallion on the back of it. We had organized football games with other clubs around the Bronx, and we played hockey in the streets. When you played hockey in the streets, you closed off the street whether the police liked it or not, and this was roller hockey. And it was good. And when you went out, you just went out during the day to play, and you came back when your mother yelled for you. Worked in all kinds of places during that phase of my life. Worked in a dairy, worked in a vegetable store, worked in a movie theater, worked in a butcher delivering orders, and worked all through high school. After high school, I went to work. That was in 1950, I guess, and went to work at a firm called HIP, Health Insurance Plan of Greater New York. After being a messenger for a while, they put me in their IBM department. At that time, there were no computers, but they were the computers of the time, where punch cards were the thing, with the way they did the electric accounting machines, and IBM was the big company in that field. And they trained me somewhat in that field, which turned out to be a good thing. Worked there in the early 50s, very early 50s, when my father passed away. Albert Molho passed away in May of 1951, which was a great shock. He was a relatively young man. He was 52 years old. A problem for our family, but my mother went to work and things settled down, and we were okay with that after the initial shock. I was drafted into the Army in May of 1952 during the Korean War. I went with my friend Max Cam. We were drafted together. We went down to Whitehall Street. We walked into this big room with hundreds of guys sitting there. We sat down in chairs, and they handed out some papers to us, our draft papers. And on my paper, it said U.S. Army, and on his paper, it said U.S. Marines. And he almost died with shock because he was drafted into the Marines. In those days, they were drafting into the Marines. I was very fortunate. I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, did 8 weeks of basic training, then went to IBM school, and then they sent me to Japan for almost 2 years, which was the best, actually, in retrospect, the best thing that ever happened to me. I hardly ever got out of the Bronx when I was growing up. But here I was in Japan, and I grew up in Japan. I began to read extensively. I traveled the country. I met lots of Japanese people and lived among the Japanese, and I matured. It's a whole different life. I was working in Yokohama at the Yokohama Ordnance Depot, and we were doing statistical work. This was during the Korean War, and we were running statistics for the war, for ordnance that was being sent over there and so on. And we were working and training many of the Japanese personnel with our IBM equipment. They've done quite well with computers since then. Through the Japanese people that worked for me, I got to know them personally. And there was no problem or hostility because of the war. They couldn't have been nicer or more inquisitive about the American life, and showed me about their life. The fascinating thing which I couldn't understand, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment, which I was mentioning before, that now seems like an inconvenience, but they lived in even much smaller spaces. But it's incredible how well they did in these tiny little spaces, and how clean and how well organized everything was. And I found them very interesting, and I did a lot of traveling for the first time in my life. I mentioned I did a lot of reading. I fell in love with the country. Got out of the Army in 1954, May of 54, and went back to HIP to work, and met Rosalind Rubin. Married in 56, so this coming June we'll be married 60 years. It's a miracle. Who's married that long? So we got married in 56, and the story goes on. Lived in the Bronx for a while, moved to Jackson Heights, left HIP and went to work for a firm called Accounting Statistics. Became a manager and improved my skills, met a lot of customers. And I didn't mention I was going to college at night during this time. I went to City College downtown, CCNY, majored in public accounting. I graduated. We were going to school, I guess, 3 nights a week, working all day. It didn't seem hard at the time. Everybody tells me it was very hard. It didn't seem that hard. But in '62, when I graduated, I decided to go into business on my own. It was my first real business. I borrowed $5,000 from Roz's mom, and I started a small business, Automatic Accounting Systems. It was a service bureau. We did payrolls and statistics and sales analyses for various companies. And my old friend Arnie Stone was one of my first clients. He was working for a firm called Drew Lawrence Corporation, and he became one of my clients. And so Arnie and I, who grew up in the Bronx together, hooked up again at that point in our life. It went well, but it was getting very hard. I didn't have a partner, and I was getting a lot of employees. It was getting difficult, so a firm was interested in me, and I was acquired by a public corporation called ITEL Corporation. And that went nicely, but I didn't like working for anybody. I was a vice president in charge of the payroll division, but I wasn't very happy working. So for that company, when my contract was up, I left with a restrictive covenant. I couldn't go back into that business which they acquired. And I left, and I went into business with that old friend I mentioned, Arnie Stone. We opened a small firm called ICM Films. Arnie was a well-known director, and he made me a producer. I financed the operation, and we went on and did quite well, doing commercials for a variety of well-known companies. Did a lot of traveling, and I think I was a good producer, and we did a lot of good work, and not only the good, but I always wanted to do, I always said that if you're going to try and make a living at something you enjoy doing. I think that's the most critical thing that you can do with your life, with your working life. And I've always done that, and that, of course, I very much enjoyed that. I learned about a whole new industry, And that was great fun. We did a lot of good work. And the only reason I stopped was that I just needed more money. I went on to something else, and it worked out very well for Arnie. Arnie then went on to grow the firm and do very, very well with the firm, become even a more well-known director than he already was. Alan and Eric Molho were born the previous period that I mentioned. Alan and Eric were educated in Ardsley, went on to college, Alan Union College, Eric to Vassar. And we stayed there for a long time, 25 years, where the kids grew up. Eric went on to medical school from Vassar. He went to Albany Med. At Vassar, he met his future wife, Stacy, who became a lawyer up in Albany and became a neurologist that does mostly Parkinson's disease. Alan married a wonderful young lady also, Jill. I now have 5 grandkids, and we live a very nice life. We have lots of friends, some of which are still with us, of course, some not. So I found a partner who was always interested in going into business, and we found a very small company called Council Press. They were in business for 20 years. It had 4 employees, and they did appellate printing. A quick description is when lawyers appeal a case to a higher court, they have to put a record together and a brief, and this little company put all this material together, assembled it, printed it, and filed it in the various courts, the Supreme Court or the federal courts or the local courts in New York State. And that firm grew and did very well. We went from 4 employees to 100 employees, and we did very nicely. It was a very successful firm. And then my partner decided he wanted to cash out, and a lot of companies were interested in us, and a public company bought Council Press. And I was with them till my contract was out, same story, and then I cashed out. Opened another small business of some kind, and then decided to retire. I retired I was 60 years old. I want to mention during these years in Ardsley and so on, one of the highlights of our life, Roz and I did a lot of traveling. We traveled all over the world. We were in Italy and France. We eventually went to China, we went to Japan. Here in the US, we took an RV trip and we started going across the country. We went for 2 months. And it was one of the highlights. With all the traveling we've done all over the world, this was one of the great highlights of going Colorado, Utah, all those incredible states that I know most people here in the US don't get to. We're now here in Kent, Connecticut. We bought some land in Kent, Connecticut in 1984 and designed and built our own house up here on Cobble Road. After I retired, we wanted to do something to give back and get involved with the community. So we got involved with the library. I'm on the board of directors of the library. We do a lot of fundraising for the Kent Library. One of the fundraisers is that we run a raffle every year. We buy a car and raffle it off. I've been managing that for the last 8 years or so. It's an operation with many, many volunteers. And Roz, who's really involved, another fundraiser we do for the library is a gala that we do every year, where we have a big party at one of the major houses. We have lots of beautiful houses here in Kent with lots of property. And every year we find a different house, and we have a big party. We invite people to for a fee. We charge $75, and we have sponsors. And Roz is in charge of that, is in charge of organizing and running that gala. And usually we have about 300 people that come, and it's quite successful. It raises over $40,000 for the library. And then we continue I continue to be on the board, and Rosie is the head of the Friends of the Library, so that's one of our very active volunteer things that we do.
Fly me to the moon.
We're looking ahead to the future. I'm going to be 83 years old in this coming September. I mentioned we're going to be married 60 years. My grandkids, let's see, I'm going to mention all my grandkids. We're so proud of my grandkids. There's Graham, Dylan, and Lucas up in Albany. Two of them graduated college. Dylan is going for his PhD. Graham is working for a very good firm, and Lucas is going just in college. Willa in New York, my grandson Nicky in New York, and they're both fabulous soccer players, and I've seen them play, and they're very talented. And as far as the future, we intend to continue to hopefully live a healthy life, which is really primary at our age, and do some traveling and spend some time with our good friends here in Kent. My grandkids know I love them and I wish them all the best, and I hope they get to see this while I'm still alive, but if not, they'll have something after we're gone.
In other words, please be true.